Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Just going to give people a couple minutes just to get in and then we'll get started. So if you're on, maybe quickly grab yourself a drink and then we'll say get going. We're a couple minutes past, so we'll just get started now. So again, good morning, everyone. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us on this webinar to talk about the upcoming changes to the water tariffs. So the plan for the webinar is as follows, if I can get my thing to work. So just going to be a quick introduction from me for those who don't know us at Dukefield Energy. And then I'm going to hand over to Connor at Castlewater. He's going to talk you through the context of the tariff settings, the overview of the changes and individual company approaches, and the sort of medium-term impacts up until 2030. So first of all, my name's Matt Mooney. I'm the head of Dukefield Energy. So for those of you, again, who don't know who we are, we're a utilities consultancy company, and we've been supporting the public sector for over 25 years now. We manage several frameworks on behalf of several public sector bodies, and the one we're specifically looking at that's relevant to today's webinar is long-winded name, National Public Sector Framework for the Provision of Water Supply and Services. Never have any interesting sounding names, do they? But that's that. So that is hosted by Surrey County Council, and the idea behind this framework is to provide public sector bodies with a compliant route to market, and it's designed to be a one-stop shop for all your sort of water supply and services needs. Like I say, I was keeping it brief because not here to listen to me, here to listen to the experts. So go hand over to Connor Kearney, who is the head of business development at Castlewater. So over to you, Connor.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining this morning. I appreciate there's a lot going on in the wider energy market, but hopefully I can give you an overview of the 26-27 pricing that's coming into effect in April, and then hopefully give you an understanding as well into the medium term of where the charging structure and wider framework that governs that is going in the water market in England. So I'll start off by just demonstrating how future tariffs can be forecast normally. So to start with, tariffs are set within Ofwat's revenue control framework. So this defines how much revenue companies are allowed to recover, and that's including for non-household customers over a 5-year AMP period. So we're currently in AMP 8, and that covers from 2025 to 2030. And the next price review will be in 2029, and that will run from 2030 to 2035. So because of the AMP structure, there is a degree of feasibility in forecasting the charges over the period, but only to a degree. So each year, the indicative tariffs for the following April are published each October, which is a regulatory requirement. And then we get the final tariffs in January of each year. But importantly, there is no strict limit on how much tariffs can change between the indicative tariffs published in October and then the final tariffs that are issued on the 14th of January. So as you can imagine, in practice, this makes forecasting quite complex. So tariffs are influenced by a number of factors. So it's a reconciliation against actual revenue from 2 years prior, changes in consumption forecasts, performance incentives such as the ODIs, which is the operational KPIs, and the MEXs, which is the customer experience measures for wholesalers. And this can move tariffs by around circa 5%. And there are also changes to charging methodology and rules, which I will come on to, and then inflation adjustments through the CPIH at the end of November. So while we can understand directionally where tariffs are going within an AMP, precision is always limited. So if we move on to the next slide, just to look at the framework and policy direction of how the tariffs are being set. So I would say, to compound the difficulty, the regulatory framework that governs this tariff structure is also evolving. And there's a now stronger focus on water efficiency. So tariffs are governed by the wholesale charging rules set out by Ofwat. So Ofwat's charging rules under Section 66A of the Water Industry Act 91, they're required to issue rules to companies for charges for businesses, and to revise these rules if having regard to government changing guidance, if that is appropriate to do so. So you may have seen that Ofwat consultation was issued in September 2025. So this consultation was undertaken by the Independent Water Commission. It was led by Sir John Cunliffe, so you'll often hear it referred to in the media as the Cunliffe Report. But essentially it highlighted the need for greater water efficiency in the non-household sector, and it recommends that charging structures be changed to incentivize water efficiency. So under the current wholesale charging rules, discounts are permitted if they reflect lower costs. However, the Commission had a concern that the structure may be creating perverse incentives for large businesses to use more water. So they examined the rationale between the large user tariffs in the market, and to see if there could be alternative approaches in setting how these large user tariffs are applied to provide better price signals to put a value on water efficiency, such as applying large user discounts through fixed rather than volumetric charges. And if you're not aware, under a large user tariff, customers pay a higher fixed charge but a lower rate per unit of water. So the rationale behind this is that supplying large volumes of water costs less per unit, so the unit price is reduced, while the fixed charge ensures that the water undertakers are still able to recover their infrastructural costs. So the Commission continued by looking to amend the wholesale charging rules to, again, as I said, support that water efficiency. But it stated that companies perceive that the charging rules as they currently stand are a barrier to reforming the overall charging structure, and that they propose to address this perception by enabling companies to place more weight on water scarcity considerations while setting charges, as opposed to purely looking at the recovery of costs. So Ofwat's recent consultation highlighted the say concerns around large user discounts, that might encourage higher consumption, and as a result there is that increased focus on the changing of how the tariffs are structured in the market, and moving away from those volumetric discounts and strengthening price signals linked to water scarcity. So if we move on to the next slide to look what actually the Cunliffe report recommended. In recommendation 38, that said tariff structure be changed to incentivize water efficiency, and that could include removing falling block tariffs for non-household consumption. So this change was referenced in some of the wholesaler comments of their indicative tariffs that were issued in October for 26-27. However, there was a big difference on how these indicative tariffs were to be applied through the final tariffs. Wholesalers, some of which have backed off implementing this change and applying a more phased approach, and others have actually sped up with a more aggressive approach and moving forward at a greater pace. Alongside this, there was also an amendment brought forward into the Water Act 2014, which was implemented in 2015, to add a fifth statutory duty to Ofwat's remit, and this is the resilience objective. So the resilience objective mentioned, subsection 2AE, was A, to secure the long-term resilience of water undertakers, supply systems and sewerage undertakers' sewerage systems as regards environmental pressures, population growth and changes in consumer behaviour, and to B, secure that undertakers take steps for the purposes of enabling them to meet the long term the need, the supply of water, and the provision of sewerage services to consumers. And that included promoting appropriate long term planning and investment by relevant undertakers, and the taking of them a range of measures to manage resources in sustainable ways. And that's to increase efficiency in the use of water, reduce demand for water, as to reduce pressures on water resources. So, what this resilience objective is, alongside the Conduct report recommendation, is essentially the reason these tariffs are shifting from simply recovering costs to actively encouraging sustainable water use within the market. As you'll see at the bottom, the wholesale charging rules are somewhat fuzzy because Ofwat is saying the application of these rules is a matter for wholesalers, and the rules don't set out any detailed calculations or worked examples. So it's a bit like giving building regulations without a blueprint. You know the standards you need to meet, but there are multiple ways in how you can design that building. And that's why we see such variation across the various network undertakers. Moving on to demonstrate how this is applied in practice. So I've split the analysis for the indicative charges across two slides because the scale of the changes in the affinity water areas in particular, they're central and east, make it quite difficult to clearly see the broader market picture on a single slide. So what this first slide is demonstrating is a baseline for each area at 50 megalitres, comparing the actual large user wholesale charge for 25-26, i.e. the current year, and the indicative wholesale charge issued for 26-27, published in October. So this is the first real clear signal in indicative tariffs how large user pricing is starting to change structurally. So for most standard large users, they'll see an increase between 2 and 23% based on the indicative charges. Southeast Water, 14%. Thames Water, United Utilities, an increase of 21%. Southern Water, slightly higher again at 23%. Yorkshire, Wessex, Severn, Trent at the lower end of that, between 2 and 8%. But then if we jump to the next slide, you'll see a huge variation in from the previous slide, and that's really driven by the 34% increases in affinity central area for the tariffs for large and extra large users, and for extra large users in the affinity east area. But also you'll see within the affinity, I appreciate it's maybe difficult to see on the graph, but there's also a 7% reduction in charges for the affinity east area tariff. So overall, typical large users are going to see moderate increases. But underneath, some large users are facing much bigger hikes, and companies are rebalancing tariffs, cutting large user discounts, and they're sending out strong signals to the market that water needs to be used more efficiently. So moving on to looking at how the indicative tariffs in October compared to the final tariff that were issued in January of this year. So when we compare the indicative and final tariffs, we see some interesting differences in the approach. So taking Affinity Water forward, they actually reduced their tariffs quite significantly between the indicative and final, with reductions of around 10 to 15% 10 to 15 percentage points in some cases. And this suggests that they're taking a more phased approach to implementation of this change, softening the impact of large users, but while also moving towards a regulatory goal of reducing discounts and rebalancing charges. However, you'll see the very large users are still experiencing a significant increase in costs from April. In contrast, the affinity softening their approach between indicative to final, Southern Water have actually increased further, moving from 23% increase at indicative to 32% at final, signifying a more aggressive approach to the structural change. I would say that the other companies in England are somewhat in between, with smaller adjustments in either direction. The insight here is that all companies are heading in the same direction of phasing out large user discounts and rebalancing tariffs, but the pace and approach greatly differ. And some are preferring to implement that change gradually over the AMP, while others are taking a more immediate approach. And ultimately, this will directly affect how you will experience your bills from year to year. So then if we move on to looking at a high level overview of individual company approaches to the pricing of 26-27 that'll come in April. So Yorkshire Water, the average change is between 6 and 6.7% of an increase. They do acknowledge that Ofwat's consultation to the changing of rules, but they say they feel that this will not lead to a significant change in the current charging structure. Anglian water bills will range from an increase of 8.1% to 12.5%, with large users at the higher end of that range being most impacted. No other points in significant changes statement were made, so it's difficult to understand where they are in terms of the speed of that implementation. Northumbrian Water adjusted consumption bands in line with tariff simplification, and that's more focused at mid-level users. They added a standard ammonia charge for new large trade effluent discharges above a certain threshold, but on average an increase of 5%. Moving on to Severn Trent. So the bill charges vary from 1.4% increase to 14.4% increase. So the lower volume users being hit with the highest increases. The large user increase sits at around between 4 and 5%, except for the Chester area, which will see an increase of between 8 and 10. They have also moved to simplify and standardize their tariffs. They've reduced the fixed charge tariffs bands from 11 to 4, and the volumetric charges are now across 5 tariff bands. Southern Water, so on average, their water is going to increase by 28%, which is mitigated slightly by a 6% decrease in the average waste cost. They're continuing that phased approach to reducing the discount that large users attract, but they stated that they expect this to be removed in its entirety by 28-29. United Utilities, they have an average increase across the customer base of about 11.9%. Southeast, the weighted average increase of 12.8%. Affinity Water, as I mentioned, they are working towards aligning charges across their 3 regions, and this does explain why there is a reduction in some charges in some areas. But bill changes for 26-27 are extremely varied, as I've already demonstrated, and it goes across all levels of users. They significantly reduced the proposed increases to that large user tariff since the indicative charges were issued, again, as I have outlined. However, they are still moving towards reducing or fully removing those discounts on volumetric rates for large users on a phased basis. Thames Water are moving intermediate water users onto standard tariff, again in line with tariff simplification, and the average increase in charges just under 5% for combined customers who utilise both water and waste services with Thames Water. There is an increase in water, which is mitigated by a decrease in waste. And finally, Wessex, they're increasing water volumetric charges for mid to large users, with their largest users facing 15% increase. They will be phasing out the large user consumption tariff banding over this AMP, but overall bill change varies from a reduction of 2.4% for the lowest volume users and 10.9% for its largest users. So appreciate that was a very high level overview, but moving on to how that looks going forward. So as I have outlined, there is a strong shift away from the large user discounts in the market, and the likes of Southern Water, Affinity Water, Wessex have already started phasing these out. Some wholesalers have not pushed these out yet, but large users are still likely to be hit by this over the next 3 to 4 years. There's likely to be more changes to tariff banding. There is a move towards tariff simplification and alignment of tariff bandings across the market. As you may be aware, there's over 300 water tariffs in the market in England. It's very difficult for customers like yourselves to compare apples with apples when there is such a complex tariff structure. But how these impacts will ultimately be mixed across users, with some saying no change and others saying increased charges as bandings are merged as part of this simplification piece. There are more potential changes to charging methodology in line with the Cunliffe review and comments in order to encourage the water efficiency piece. So very much in the next year, it's been focused on the large users in the market, but the likelihood is that that will feed through the other band tariffs and the other size of users as we move forward in the charging structure. But ultimately, as you may be aware, there's a pressure on wholesalers to increase the infrastructural investment, and ultimately that will lead to increased costs across the water tariffs. In terms of Castle Water, we are helping our customers, first of all, understand each October what the indicative charges will mean on their portfolio spends for the following April, to allow them to ultimately to take steps internally to either mitigate or be able to accommodate the rises that are coming in. And then again in January, when the final tariffs are issued, we will supply our customers with a definitive forecast for their wholesale charges that are due to come in April. And I think that we are unique in that. I do not see other retailers offering that budgetary forecasting. I think it really helps when you're budgetary planning and making sure that you're aware and make the wider organization aware of what's coming down the track. And beyond that, moving into the medium term, as we go on to the next AMP, we'll continue to communicate with our customers and to ensure that they're aware of what is coming again down the track, but also how we are advocating to Ofwat and to the wholesalers to ensure that our customers get the best outcome as part of this changes to the framework and the methodology. Why Castle Water are uniquely placed to do this is that we're independent from the water wholesalers in the market. A lot of our competitors are owned by water wholesalers and joint ventures, and we don't see that they're willing to rock the boat with their parent organization. As being the largest independent water retailer in the UK, we're uniquely positioned and have demonstrated that we're able to advocate and get results for customers in the market, and we do not have a skin in the game and are happy to advocate with the customer at the center of our approach. I really appreciate your time. I hope that was useful, and I'd welcome any questions.
Yeah, so in terms of questions, you've got the Q&A function if you just want to type your questions in, or if you just raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can vocalize your questions. Anything? There's a question in the chat there. Sorry, my chat function is taking a little while to load. Jane, would it be possible to see a similar session for gas and electricity? Guess I'll take that one. So, yeah, we can look to do that. We'll see. Obviously, we have the framework with gas and electricity on, so we can see which of our partners can help deliver that session. If that's something that people will be interested in, we're always open to providing informative webinars to our customer base and obviously the wider public sector. Yeah, completely understanding the current climate. Yes, it's it's obviously the hot topic at the minute, but with these changes coming in April, we thought it was still important to inform people about the upcoming changes, even though it might not be first on everyone's agenda.
No, sorry, that's a good question, Louise. That's 50 using 50 megaliters or more, so 50,000 cubic meters per annum. And that's on per site basis as opposed to an individual spid. But if anyone on the webinar would like to understand the impact on their portfolio, in particular, because I appreciate the complexity of the tariff structure and the different wholesalers makes it difficult for you to understand where this will land specifically for your charges, please reach out to me directly. Happy to um, happy to provide a detailed overview and how Castle Water can help you moving forward and maybe reduce your costs to help ease the burden of these increases. Yeah, that's a fair point. Louise, if you're not near that usage, what I would say is that they've started with the large users in the market, but with the increased focus on water efficiency more generally in the market, it is likely to filter down across all bands. So although it's, I say it started with the large users, it's likely to have an impact across the entirety of the tariff bands across all wholesalers. So it is good to understand that it's coming and ultimately just keep on top of how that impacts across the different levels as the recommendations and consultation of the Conduct report are taken forward.
The last call for any questions. It doesn't look like it. So thank you everyone for joining. Like Con said, if you want to reach out to Connor or myself and want to set up a further call to discuss your impact more specifically, then please do so. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you very
Thanks very
much.
much. Appreciate your time. Enjoy your day. Yeah, we can share contact details after this call.
Yeah, yeah.